Bryce, what are you doing?
Trying to, game.
What?
This game is really hard.
Pac-Man?
Yeah.
Dude, you're supposed to be playing the game for next week's episode of Arcade Bookshop.
I mean, I will. I'm really close to beating this.
Right. And what about the book?
Huh?
We're supposed to finish a book for the podcast too?
Oh yeah, I finished that last week. Yes!
Oh, did you finally beat it?
Uh-huh. The first level.
Oh boy.
Listen up now, we can leave on. Get ready for Arcade Bookshop with your Bob. We play a game, check it out. Don't be lame. Listen up now, we can leave on. Get ready for Arcade Bookshop.
You can listen to new episodes of Arcade Bookshop every other Monday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your pods. You'll always find us with a controller in one hand and a book in the other.
You are listening to the Drunken Pen Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Caleb James. With me, as always, I didn't give you a name today.
You didn't give me a name.
Spencer, the Bermuda Barnacle Basher Church.
No. You've had better.
Bashing barnacles. Today, I told you we'd have a more professional episode, hopefully. So today, we have a special guest. Cited 5 times as a notable essayist by the Best American Essays Annual Anthology, and he also holds an MFA in Creative Writing from Brooklyn College. The author of My Life of Crime Essays and Other Entertainments, Tyler C. Gore. We appreciate you coming on, Tyler.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm happy to be here.
I am going to do a quick reading. It's a little bit lengthy, but you have a synopsis on your website, which if anybody wants to check that out, it's tylergore.com, of My Life of Crime. I just really enjoyed this, and I also highly recommend, which I did just earlier today, if you just look up Tyler C. Gore on YouTube, you have a bunch of readings of this book.
That's true. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And you went, the one I listened to, I think it might have just been the first video, but it was the one where you were talking about your pizza prank. And then you did a reading of your appendix, which is like a novella length in the book. And I just loved it. Like the comedic timing and everything. It was just cracking me up. So for folks who think, oh, I don't really want to, read essays or anything or memoirs, I highly recommend checking out the videos. They're quick and I think it'll change your mind.
Thanks, man. Thank you very much.
So, My Life of Crime, Essays and Other Entertainments. The delightful debut collection of personal essays by Tyler C. Gore. An awkward visit to a nude beach, a bike-pedaling angel careening through rush hour traffic, the mystery of a sandwich found in a bathroom stall, a lyric, rainy day ramble through the East Village. With the personal essays and 3 other entertainments in this debut collection, Tyler C. Gore reveals the artistic secrets of his life of crime, a charming wit, compassionate observation, perfection of style, and overall, a winsomely colorful light tinge with just enough to spare. Whether stewing over a subway encounter with a deranged businessman, confessing his sordid past as a prankster, or recounting his family's history of hoarding, Gore is by turns melancholy, profound, and hilarious. The collection culminates with the novella-length essay Appendix, a twisted, sprawling account of routine surgery that grapples with evolution, mortality, strangely attractive doctors, simulated universes, and an anorexic cat. My Life of Crime conjures up from the flotsam of an individual life something uncannily majestic, an insomniatic contemplation of life in our eternal 24-hour New York City infused throughout with its grit, humanity, unexpected romance, and the poignant intimacy of all the lives joined together within it. Like I said, that was a little bit lengthy, but that just gives you kind of a touch of your writing style, for one, I think. Just like, at least from the reading, I haven't actually read your book, but just from the reading you gave, it just had like this witty, funny style that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Caleb. I appreciate that. Yeah, humor is like a really big part of the whole book and also my approach to memoir. My approach to memoir is they're comedies, even though they're, full of bittersweet or poignant elements. I think of them as comedies, what I write.
Well, I've flirted with essay writing and maybe have had a fling with the sultry cousin memoir, but I never really stuck with it. It wasn't something, I don't know if it was just my skill set or something that probably I'd just revisit in the future. But how did you get into essay writing? And more importantly, how did you get so damn good at it?
Thanks, man. I guess, it's strange. So I have an MFA in fiction, actually, not in nonfiction, but one of the earliest essays in my life of crime was the essay Stuff, which was about my family's hoarding issues, basically, and my own. I think that was where I began to figure out how to write a personal essay where you bring in your own voice, like you're talking to your friends to try to capture that feeling of, I'm just hanging out talking to you and I'm going to tell you a story about how fucked up my life is in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Stuff was the first essay where, I was under pressure to write it there's some of this in the introduction of the book. I was doing it for a graduate class and I needed to get this written. And something about the pressure of that made me reach into my own voice for it. And so I think that's part of the key of the kinds of personal essays or memoirs. I, to be honest, I don't know what the difference is with what I write. You could call it either, but was tapping into that voice. And what happened was I wound up, for a while, I had a column for a small newspaper in Long Island where I could just write whatever I wanted to. And I just began writing stories about my life. So that's how I began working in this genre.
I'm trying to think because I don't know much about like crafting essays other than just, what we learned in school and stuff. So if you started with like a fiction background, is that kind of changed the way you'd go into it? Because these aren't academic essays. These are personal. Like you said, what's the difference between essay and memoir? It's more of just like a, fun story at times. But, you also talk mortality and different things. So I imagine you are going with a lot of the themes you would take from fiction, but attributed it to your personal life.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the approach in the personal essay or memoir, whatever we're calling these, so they're not essays, just to let everybody know, and I think you've already made that clear. These aren't essays like the kind of essays where you want to prove a point about something or anything like that. These are stories. But they're real stories. They're true stories from my life. So that's what this collection is. I feel like I'm straying a bit from what you originally brought up. What did you ask me? Remind me. This is the Drunken Writer podcast.
Yeah.
You can't ask me follow-up questions on what I said because I just, once it comes out of my mouth, it's gone.
Where were we heading? You were asking, about a fiction background. You know what I wanted to say about that was that, yes, a lot of the same tools you use in fiction where you have an arc, like a story arc, come into play, where you have characterization of people, you have dialogue, description, all of those fictional tools when you're telling a true story are still very much in play, just as much as when you're making up a story. That's what I wanted to say.
We're probably going to jump around a lot, but do you have any inspirations for your style of writing with essays and memoirs? Like, for instance, famous memoirs you might have read or biographies or things like that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think David Sedaris is great. I think what I do is in a similar genre to what he does. And I've seen him read, by the way. He is a terrific reader of his own work. Another writer that would be an important one to me for this genre would be David Foster Wallace. He wrote the famous essay, A Supposedly Funny Thing I'll Never Do Again. He's terrific. I love his essay, and maybe I picked up a little bit of his habit of making footnotes for everything, because I have a lot of footnotes and appendix, particularly the long essay that's in this collection. So he's another one I like a lot. Oh, Joy Williams, who's a fiction writer, also is a terrific essayist. She's another one I really like. She she wrote an essay a long time ago called Babies, which I can't, like a lot of good works of art, I can't easily summarize it, but it is savagely funny. Those are all people I can think of off the top of my head that are important writers to me in terms of essay writing. And they're all, what I'm thinking of is all essays in this genre where they're personal stories about their lives.
The David Foster Wallace inspiration is interesting to me because the only work of his I read, which we did on the podcast, was his Oblivion stories. And just how dense some of those stories were, which were purposely done, but his writing style is very specific and it's not for everyone. So when your work, from what I've read and what I heard you read, does not seem David Foster Wallace-esque in that regard, but I have not read his essays. Are his essays different just from his actual stories?
I think so. I'm in the opposite camp from you. I actually haven't read his fiction. I haven't read Infinite Jest, but his essays, a lot of them were written for Harper's. He used to have kind of a thing, and that's where actually I first encountered him before I got that collection. I think three collections of essays, and they're super readable and they're super funny. I mean, yeah, he's got footnotes and things like that, which in itself is kind of funny. But I mean, he wrote a great one about going to I think it's like the 4-H, carnival where, he's a Midwestern guy going there. They're more like David Sedaris, where these are really funny stories he tells, and he's actually really good at it. His last collection was I think it's called Remember the Lobster, and the title essay for that is where he goes to this big lobster festival in Maine and just becomes horrified by this sort of genocide of lobsters all around him where they're boiling in pots, and begins researching what do lobsters really like? What do they feel? And he just becomes horrified by the idea of eating lobster altogether. So he brings this kind of neurotic, funny sensibility to his writing. So you should read his essays. I think you might like them.
Well, just from his short stories, because after reading those, I couldn't do Infinite Jest. There's no way. But from his short stories, there were some that you could tell, oh, this guy could be, hilarious. He could be funny. He could probably, he could do things that'll make you feel certain ways and then pull the rug out from underneath you. So, the essays probably are more human, which is, if you haven't read his fiction, it's kind of weird to say, but probably more human than what his fiction is, because his fiction is like reading AI generated scientific journal. It's very not all of the stories, but a lot of them are like that. So I would actually be interested to check out some of his essays.
Yeah, one day I have to wade into his fiction to find out what the difference is. His essays are super readable, so they're not they don't feel generated by AI. They feel like generated by a very smart, neurotic Midwesterner who's fond of footnotes, but really funny.
The footnote thing I always thought was, I mean, you talk about crazy amount of footnotes. I just never really got how you could go into a work and just have so many footnotes. But if you were dabbling in it, what is it? Just something that was fun to do, or what made you really want to just go into it as fun?
So that's mostly an appendix has footnotes. And so they'll just be long asides. It's a way of cramming in more stuff than you could cram into the flow of the paragraph. One footnote, for example, is I have this whole thing in appendix where I start talking about the music I listen to when I'm drinking and sad. And Regina Spektor is discussed a lot. But then there's a footnote about how I first encountered Regina Spektor, her music, which was I don't know if you guys know the show, the HBO show, The Leftovers.
Yeah,
it's kind of
it's based off of a novel too. I never got around to reading it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's based on a novel. The first season apparently followed. I haven't read the novel, but it's based on a novel by the same title. Tom Perrotta, if I'm saying his name right. That's who wrote the novel, and he was consultant on it. And then in the second two seasons, they went off book. I use a footnote to go on a long thing about why I think The Leftovers is arguably the best television show ever made. That's the kind of thing I'm using footnotes for.
That makes it sound like it's almost just the inside look into the author's thoughts. So you could just read this as just this is what you'll get, the stories and everything that are in the book. Or you could read some of these footnotes and then you actually dive deeper into it. And then it sounds like you did it more of like a fun entertainment way versus, like I said, I don't know about Foster Wallace's footnotes in his essays or anything, but just in like a lot of his works, it's just a lot of scientific jargon and stuff that nobody would ever give a shit about. And then he has footnotes on footnotes and end notes, and
he does a little mixture of both in his personal essays, but a lot of them are exactly like what I'm talking about, where he uses it to go on some weird tangent. Another, like one of my footnotes, like when they first started appearing in the essay, and I didn't know I was going to do that. I just started doing it while I was writing appendix, but like one of the footnotes was like, oh, something to do about the occurrence of appendicitis in children and stuff. And the footnote says, source, I Googled it. You know, it's like that, you know?
That's great. Source, Wikipedia, don't take as proper information.
Right, exactly.
Now, I don't know if you've done this with your collection, but I know some essayists, what they'll do is they'll have an overarching theme that kind of pulls the whole thing together. And then some people, they just prefer to have almost like individual stories or anecdotes or just individual essays. It depends on the kind of reading. But people go into it with various styles. So do you have overarching themes that pull it together? Are the stories interconnected? Or is it just, oh, here's fun shit that I did, here's sad shit, you know, things like that?
Yeah, there's definitely like a sort of theme that runs through it, I think. I mean, it takes you through a big portion of my life. Like, you know, part of it deals with, I grew up in northern New Jersey, just outside of the city. And then I've spent pretty much since my early 20s, most of my adult life in the city, with an exception, which is in the course of the essays that's in there too, where I went out and went back to where I grew up to partly save money because I was going back to school after dropping out of school when I was younger. I would say part of the arc of the whole collection taken as a whole is, I think it's kind of a love letter to New York City in some ways. Like I'm either an exile from New York when I'm in the suburbs or I'm living here. I really do feel that this sort of deep love for New York City, and it is a terrible place to live. Let me tell you, it is so sucky. It's so expensive. When people come visit me from, you know, my wife's brother lives in Texas. When people from far away come to visit you in your apartment in New York, you see the pity in their eyes. Like, really? You just live in these tiny little rooms? That's where you live? You know, and it's like, hey, this is actually a 3-bedroom. This is pretty good for New York, you know? You put up with all of that, but what you get in return is like every day, you know, I walk through the streets and I wind up having a conversation with somebody who is a stranger or somebody I don't know that well. This happens every day, or I'll see just something completely batshit crazy, you know? So I remember years ago living in Manhattan, there used to be a guy in the Village. I don't know where he was getting these from, someplace he shouldn't have, but he would walk around with like a branch of a tree tied to his head and just walk around that way. Those kinds of random things that happen every day in the city, for me, these are solid gold. Hopefully in the book, I have like a lot of that in there. Like there's a whole thing in the section you read about where I was in the East Village and there was literally an angel bicycling down the street in this huge, like rickshaw-like bicycle. He had a harp, like a whole harp on the back of the bicycle. That's New York, where it's like, you know, people are just walking by like, huh, angel on a bicycle. You know,
There's a normal occurrence around here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, that would be a theme, I think, one of the themes of the book. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because every time we have a writer on who's from New York, or just creatives in general, it's always, I hate the city, but they love being there because just like you said, you go out and you see an angel on a bike. Oh, there's an idea. There's a story. There's a inspiration of some sort. It's just constant. You talk to people like these kind of cities, you know, that's why people were drawn to Paris in the 20s and 30s. That's why, you know, London has such an appeal to people. It's because these experiences you get in these major cities, you don't get anywhere else. Like where we're from, we were saying off air, we're about 30 minutes south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh's kind of a literary town, but it's not a huge city. So you have weird experiences, but not often things that you're really going to write about. But where we're from is a smaller town. And if you're a writer, your writing's more about escaping the place. Yeah. Like you're not writing about the town. You're not, you know, Faulkner writing about Mississippi or Missouri or whatever. You're writing about like, how would I get away from here? What's the world away from here?
Right.
So you actually would have the opposite because you want to tell these stories from New York because they're so crazy and weird and entertaining. And it's almost like you don't have to do as much work because you just have to step outside.
Yeah, point taken. Although I got to tell you guys, like, I had a suburban upbringing. I grew up in the burbs, so I grew up in a small town. So that is part of who I am. So I totally get that. And I did for a while even try the country when I was much younger. I lived for a while in Western Maryland, and I discovered that wasn't for me. But my inner soul is a kid who grew up in the suburbs, for sure.
As a digression, I would think it would be interesting to go through if there was a way to find out how many famous genre writers actually came from suburbs or small towns or the country, because just like we were saying, maybe they wanted to escape versus big city writers. Like, what are they writing? Like, I would like to find some kind of comparison.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, you mentioned genre writers. I mean, it's funny because, okay, so this collection is nonfiction and they're personal essays. They're real stories about my life. But what I grew up loving and reading tons of was science fiction and fantasy. I mean, those are some of my favorite writers and books. And I think one of the first like major things was like encountering the Narnia series when I was a kid. And I can remember like opening closets and just hoping that I'd be able to walk right into, some fantastic world. So I get that. You may be right about that.
Just with your love of fiction, then, have you ever thought about doing fictitious essays or memoirs for, like, like a Hunter S. Thompson, gonzo journalism, or even like we read, I think we did it for the podcast, the Norm Macdonald, not a memoir. You don't know if it's fiction or not. Like, in the stories you read, some of it might be true, some of it might just be complete made up nonsense, and the reader they have to guess, but like that could be a lot of fun too, I would think.
Yeah, I haven't tried that per se. There is a kind of thing, I think it comes through in all of the essays, but especially in appendix, that I'm a slightly unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. There's just things about like, there's a whole thing in appendix about where I'm pretty sure, like while I'm in the hospital, I have a cup of hot water, like the nurse brought me tea without a lid on that rolling table you have over the hospital. And it got knocked all over my foot and I started screaming, right? And my wife was in the room. And in the story, I'm glaring at my wife because I'm certain you did this. You knocked it over on my foot, right? And then there's a later scene where we have an argument about it where like all of this time I'm assuming, yeah, she burned my foot in the hospital, where this comes up and she's like, I didn't do that. The nurse did it. And I was like, well, why didn't you tell me? This is actual dialogue in the thing. And she said, because you blame me for everything. Right? So there's a sense that it's not fictional, but I did kind of build in a sense of, can you fully trust what I say?
Well, if you're storytelling, I mean, it coincides with like stand-up comedy. You don't have to, but it's definitely better to embellish. So you think of the old fisherman tale, I caught a fish this big when it was, nothing impressive. But if you could make it impressive, your molehill is a mountain. So anything you can talk up in, I would say take it to that limit. Take it right to the line where it's still believable.
Especially with the comedic element into it.
Yeah.
It'd be one thing if you were doing like more of a serious kind of, but with you having that comedic element to it, you can kind of really...
Yeah, just always stay right below that limit of just ridiculous. Yeah. So I think if you could do that, then the audience is going to have a really good time.
Yeah, I think exaggeration is definitely a tool in the toolbox for any kind of comic writing. And, I do want... I'm not like super familiar with all the stand-up guys, and there's a lot of that in New York. I've seen it sometimes when I watch some specials. But yeah, for the kind of writing I do, the way of telling a story with timing and stuff like that is kind of related, even though, what I write is not like, it's not a pure stand-up routine or something like that. There's elements that I have learned from watching the people who do that. I think that's got to be the hardest of the arts, stand-up comedy.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the hardest.
Well, and it looks the easiest when it's done well. That's the funny part about it.
Well,
right. Just somebody up there just telling you funny stories about their lives. But it's like, man, like I'm sure you guys have seen this when, somebody dies on stage. It's like, oh,
Well, that was the main thing that I was really interested in, from watching that video, is like how difficult it to get to write that comedy, because again, like, we talk about like stand up, like, yes, they have it written out, but it's also like the delivery, like how they say it with a look or a lean, but it's all just printed words on a paper. I find like, because even in some of like my work and stuff, I try to add comedic elements, and I'm always worried on like, how is it gonna land, or
How's it gonna be received?
or if they're gonna get it or not, because if they don't have those certain things to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to know, like, particularly with comedy, it's hard to know if the joke lands, right? Or if the comedy comes out. I mean, I think in general, it's hard to know if you're having the effect on the reader, as you talk about when you're writing, that you think you're having. Obviously, like, sharing your work with other people can be a good indicator just to get, feedback. I actually really enjoy reading before an audience, but there's something about that where you start learning, which things work and which things don't, because nobody fakes, like, people will clap, but nobody fakes laughing.
Mm-hmm.
If they're laughing, it must be a good line.
Well, when I watched that video of you earlier, the one thing that stood out, and I don't know if it was deliberate when you went into writing it, but now that you say you actually like reading out loud, it makes more sense. You hit specific beats.
Yeah.
So when you would end on with what would be a comedic punchline, there was like the right pause. You brought the audience in, and right when they're anticipating the joke, you either lay it on them or you throw them the curveball, and then it always lands. That's something, I mean, one that's practice, to do that, especially if you're a stand-up comedian. But as a writer, to write in that style, I think that's pretty unique, because I haven't come across a lot of even comedy writers who don't do stand-up or any kind of thing like that are able to hit those Twain-esque beats. And like, I was really impressed by that.
Oh man, thank you so much. Like, I really appreciate that. It's hard with the personal essays where, there's a lot of editing and sort of like figuring out like how to get that, build in that kind of timing. And I don't really know what my inner process is for that, but I know I do spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. There's always when you tell a story about your life is just your life, right? It's just a bunch of shit that happens to you, like everybody. And there is a kind of thing when you're talking about your own experience. I think a difference from fiction, although it's related to fiction, is where, you choose your details and you cut stuff out. You think about how the timing is going to work out on the page. Yeah.
Well, even just like a very simplistic, what we're talking about, a very simplistic explanation would be like, or an example rather, from the pizza story you were telling. You had a moment, I'm going to paraphrase here. It was along the lines of, it was near the end when you were worried about getting like punished by your mother, and talking about like, oh, a 10-year-old doing this versus, someone that's older. You kind of led the audience astray, where it's like, oh, how old is he? Is he a teenager? And then you pause and you hit him with like this perfectly timed, a 28-year-old man. It was like just the ball dropped, and it's just great. Like, that's just one of those things. I don't think you can really teach that. That's like, you're talking about comedians dying on stage. A lot of the times it's not the jokes that are bad, it's the timing. So they don't, they just say it too fast or too slow, or they don't know how to play on the audience. And so that's one thing you do seem to have gotten down, is to be able to feed off the audience a little, even if it's subconscious. Well, here's where the laugh's going to come. I'm going to really hold it for a second and get it out of them. So that's like that. I don't know. That's just really cool. Like, that's something I don't know if I'd be able to do or not. Like, I don't have a problem reading in front of people, but reading my own work in front of people, I don't know. That'd be different.
Yeah. Have you done a lot of readings, or have you tried it at all?
I haven't done public read. Like, I always read stuff on air, and when we have guests, I don't mind reading in front of them, or even if I have like a whole bunch of people, like it wouldn't matter if we were at a convention, I was on stage reading in front of 1,000 people, 10,000. It doesn't matter. But reading my own work, I don't know. That would be different. Of course, I'm not writing like comedic stuff either, but.
I mean, it's interesting to do. I'll tell you something about, I'll read stuff out loud, definitely before I have to give a reading, for sure. But you discover a lot when you read something out loud. You really do. And not just for comedy. Like there is something about it where it slows you down and allows you to experience the piece almost as though somebody else had written it. And then, you start to see the weak parts in it, or even the sentences that could be cleaner or more punchy. It is actually a really good exercise that I think in general writers maybe should do more often, because it reveals a lot about the structure of the work. I just like, when you were studying poetry in school or whatever, where they would have you read a poem out loud, there's a different experience. Like with poetry, I write a little bit of poetry, but not much. But I've really found that with poetry, like you don't really understand a poem unless you've read it out loud. That's where you suddenly hear the music of it and all of that.
Which I always tell aspiring writers when I talk to them at conventions or, just the ones we meet. Like I'm a very strong proponent, and especially when you're starting out, record yourself reading. It doesn't have to be your final draft, but I always do with my final draft too. I don't really record now, I just read it out loud, but record yourself reading your work. And usually you don't even have to go to the playback, just reading it out loud. This doesn't work. This line's too wordy. This leaves me breathless. And I mean, I think we've talked about like purposefully doing those things though, too, like in the past where I want the reader to feel a certain way when they're reading this. So this is a big run-on sentence to make you out of breath. But if it's not your goal to do that,
if it's every sentence,
or
right.
There's just a lot of things you will find out about yourself and your writing style when you read it out loud, especially dialogue too. That's another good one. It's like, oh, people don't talk like that. Why did I think that was good?
Right.
And you get some kind of weird Henry James dialogue where it's like, nobody talks like this is stupid. But yeah, the poetry thing's a good example because there's a lot of poetry, especially contemporary poetry, I just don't get. Like I read it and I'm like, what the fuck is this supposed to be? But then when I hear not me reading out loud, but the actual poet reads it out loud, you go, oh, that's music. Like there's a musicality, there's a lyricism to it that I did not get at all. I listened to a podcast called Poetry Unbound. It's because I was trying to get better at understanding modern poetry. And the guy he's a poet himself, his name's Padraig Otuma, I think. And it helps because he has like this really nice Irish accent. But he reads the poetry, and then I'll read, I think on their website, they also post the poems. And I'll read them on there after he's read them, and I can understand them. But if I read them before, a lot of the times, like I'm not getting it. What am I missing? And even like some of the metaphors don't come through unless it's read out loud, which is a strange thing to think about because, how do you visualize a metaphor when somebody reads it? How does it make it better? But sometimes it does.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I've had that experience with poetry too. And I'm with you. There's a lot of poetry where on the page, I just don't, because poetry's, cryptic. It often is, right? It sort of moves through emotions and metaphors and things like that it's not like writing prose. But I've definitely had the experience where, particularly with somebody who's good at reading the poetry with feeling, where you suddenly get like all those things that are behind the poem, the musicality and all of that. And you brought up dialogue. That's another one where fictional dialogue is not written exact. Fictional dialogue is meant to sound like the way people actually speak, but it's not written that way, because that wouldn't be interesting to read, with all the ums and pauses and digressions we put in. It's meant to be like to hit those beats, as you mentioned earlier. So I definitely think dialogue is something that's good to read aloud to see how it's playing out.
Sometimes I'll come across an author who does exactly that. They try to replicate 100% what people sound like when they speak, and it's
too much sometimes.
It's usually a turn off. Like, I mean, some of the rougher examples, you think of Lovecraft, he would do a lot of bad accents for, hillbillies in the mountains and shit.
Right.
Cormac McCarthy always gets praised for doing a really good job of that, but there's some of his works I've read where I'm like, this is still too much. If it's taking me, or even like Faulkner, it's like, it's taking me out. I read The Sound of Fury. I really enjoyed it. But one thing, it was really grating at some points when you just had this deep, deep accents because, they're deep South. And it's just like, it's taking me out of the story now because I'm trying to figure out what they're saying. So It's a fine line as a fiction writer to be able to do dialogue in a way that still sounds realistic,
Yeah.
but is readable and understandable, which is that's the most important thing in communication, is that you can understand the person.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting thing with the Faulkner thing. I think the convention has kind of shifted in how people do dialect. Like, what do you guys think about that? Like, where it used to be, like somebody like Faulkner who's writing these Southern accents or black dialect from the South, those things, there'd be like AN apostrophe, like me and, Caddy or whatever. And now I think there's been sort of a shift away from that where it's like, treat this like spice or something. Use it with a light touch.
That's another one that's tough, because the Sound and the Fury would not have read the same at all without that, because that almost did add to the lyricism of the prose at times. It's just sometimes, and that's a product of its time, obviously, so it's not necessarily the best example, but I don't mind the light touch. It depends on the story you're telling overall. So, especially, okay, we'll use the Southern writer, for example. If you're telling, or even just where we're at, okay, an Appalachian Gothic, if you're telling a tale in that situation and you're hoping your reader base will understand, because maybe that's where you're marketing towards, you're from, you're living in New York, maybe you want a more New York centric accent in your works and the dialect. It makes sense if the book's going to be read by a lot of New Yorkers. You think of like Irish accents in works, or even British accents. Sometimes I'll go back and read Dickens. I'm like, why is it like I hate this? But I'm also not 1800s British. So at the time they would have probably enjoyed that, or they would have understood it wouldn't have been a problem. It just, there's a lot of nuance to it. But I do think if you're going for a general audience, a lighter touch is better. If you have a very specific story you're trying to tell, and that's important to the story, that's the main thing. Is it important to the story? If the dialects aren't going to aid in the story in some way, then just get them out of there. They're not necessary.
Especially if you don't know how to write them.
Well, that's another thing. It's, if you, like for me, okay, if I want to do some kind of California dialect or an Australian dialect or accents, I'm not going to do I'm going to do a stereotype job.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do a quality job unless I was living in that kind of place. Like, we could do the Pittsburgh Yinzer accent, and we hear that all the time. So that would be one thing we could do. But if you don't want to insult people. Like, that's one thing when I've been writing a lot of fiction set in like kind of like a Celtic setting. And when I do that, I worry that how far do I go on the Irish accents?
Especially nowadays, because you never know what's gonna.
Yeah. Well, like I wrote that one story that was about like it was set in like a 1800s Atlantic setting, like that kind of accent, like the Atlantic accent, but it was more Atlantic Irish. So that was rough, because then it's like, how far do I go into this? And it's one of those things you have to do a lot of research, I think, to get those. I didn't want to go too deep into that, but I always am very interested in how different writers go about doing dialects and accents. I think it's fun.
Yeah, no, I think it's like a big topic for writers. I guess what I was thinking about when I was saying sort of a light touch, or moving away from the way writers in the mid-century or the 19th or early 20th century used to write, is less about the accent itself, like the speech patterns, but more about the typographic way you try to render the way people pronounce something different. I think a lot of times, like, if you can reproduce the speech pattern, you don't need to rely so much on things like apostrophes or words that are spelled different than how they normally appear. My wife is from Trinidad in the West Indies, so they definitely speak English with their own dialect. Other people in the West Indies do, like Jamaicans and things like that. Trinidadians have their own, in fact, they call it dialect. And they have their own way of rendering it in print. Like, if you read Trinidadian newspapers where they're rendering something in dialect, they have their own spelling conventions for that and things like that. One of the writers I think of is V.S. Naipaul. I don't know if you know him, but he was Trinidadian writer who basically moved to England when he was very young, and sort of like T.S. Eliot became more British than the British in some ways. But his early novels were all comedies, and those are my favorites by him. I've read a lot of them. And he does Trinidadian dialect. He was writing, these books are written in the 50s and the early 60s. he has lots of Trinidadian dialect, but he mostly renders it in conventionally spelled English. But the patterns of I can't do it, but I should be able to because I've been married to a Trinidadian for 20 years. But the speech patterns are distinct enough so that if you're familiar with the dialect, you get it right away from just the speech patterns, you know?
That's kind of a cool point, and it makes me think because I said it could be offensive if you do dialects or accents wrong, but it could also be equally offensive. I would think maybe not equally, but it could still be offensive if you say you had Trinidad characters who all sound like news broadcasters. Just non-regional news broadcasters.
Right,
Everyone
right.
speaks the same. And then the people reading that are like, that's not authentic at all. This is not genuine.
Right. That's not the way this person would speak. Right. I think actually in appendix, it's only like a couple fragments of dialogue where I'm listening in the hospital to a group of West Indian women talk. And I ran that through with my wife a bit to be like, does that sound right? I have trouble. I myself, I think people who are good at doing accents, like how some comedians are, I think there's writers like that as well that can really hear the speech patterns of things. I don't know if I'm one of those writers. Like I know my own regional accents. I grew up in New Jersey and New York, but there's a lot of different accents, especially in New York. I'm fairly familiar with those, but even though I have spent a lot of time with West Indian people because of my wife, I've traveled there, I don't feel that I have enough familiarity to do, say, a long extended version of somebody who speaks in a heavy Trinidadian dialect necessarily. And so I do agree with what you're saying in terms of if you're going to do a strong regional dialect from somewhere, you've got to really have soaked in that dialect. You have to know it.
Yeah. For me, I think like when it comes to my writing, I do what I do on the podcast often. And when I do the read the James Joyce love letters that for some reason we bring up too many times, what I'll do is I'll do this faux Irish accent that's not Irish at all. It's not English. It's just very, very subtle. So I try to write like that, where it's just it's subtle.
It's very like Lucky Charms-ish.
Yeah, because the weird thing is I have a ear for a lot of accents where I know where that's from. And then I'll think, just like this, any stereotypical, like a Cockney accent. Like, oh yeah, I know exactly, Dick Van Dyke, I know how to do a shitty version of that. But then I try it and I'm just like, is he having a stroke?
Right.
What happened? This also brings up, though, something I was wondering, and you'd actually be the perfect person for this. So with your writing style being so specific, like you have a very, at least just from, what I've seen, you have a very specific author's voice. Like I think if people read your work and they were aware of who you were, like say you had a lot of books out, they would know that was your work without your title on it, like your name on the title. But with that, and then, you have MFA in fiction writing, do you think that a lot of contemporary writers have a cookie cutter style of writing now when it comes to paragraph formatting, sentence structure, maybe even the way they tell the story in general? Do you think it's too similar? Like everyone goes to these creative writing workshops and they all sound the same. Because I have come across a lot of that, but I don't know if because I don't read too much contemporary stuff, it might just be me.
Well, even like we've talked about before, now there's all these different programs and things that helps with like your,
it makes things too uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there is something, for years, people have been saying this ever since the sort of workshop model became a big thing in, I think, creative writing in the United States anyway. There's something called workshop fiction, right? Where I think that might be partly a byproduct of the workshop process, like I've taught some workshops too, so I'm aware of the danger of this. It's kind of like any nail, that sticks out of the wood, that'll be noticed by the workshop, and then the writer will want to, nail down that nail, right? But a lot of times, like you brought up Faulkner before, like what a weird writer, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's full of weird stuff. Or Herman Melville for an even more extreme example. So I think sometimes with fiction from workshops, I don't think that's the goal of a workshop, but I think it can happen that people stop taking risks and they get called out for things because it's the kinds of things you can talk about in a workshop. Like, you have this weird way of writing about this, or this sentence is a weird sentence, where a lot of times, like in really great fiction, the weirdness is part of what makes it great. Like something that is strange to you, unique to you is what I mean. In that sense, I think I do know what you're talking about in terms of workshop fiction. And I think it's something like anybody in a workshop or anybody teaching a workshop is probably aware of and should be wary of. Just because everybody focused on this weird sentence that you wrote does not necessarily mean you should change that sentence, you know? Because it has to be a product of an individual mind, right?
Right. Well, on the other side of the coin, what I think is also happening is not just like the workshop, but when you have, like, for instance, some of the most interesting writers I've come across in the last few months is when we've been interviewing a lot of these smaller press writers, such as yourself. Like, you're not, not the big 3 or 5 or whatever they are now.
Right.
But when you go through these big publishers, it's a formula. What they're publishing is formulaic. So that's when you get your James Pattersons and stuff. You have a lot of people who want to replicate that success, and you also have the publisher who want to replicate the successes of these books. So what do? They will take on the writers that they feel are going to sell the most, and they will reach the biggest audience and the most general audience. So that tends to be this formulaic, uniform style of writing across the board. And it might not even be that author's intention, but after the editing passes and going through the system, it's like, hey, this is what's going to sell the best. We, our analytics, because analytics rule everything now. Analytics have gone through and made it so it's like, well, it says that the 3 to 4 sentence paragraph is what keeps the readers interested the most. And what analytics don't tell you is it also will make you zone out, and you'll read the whole book and you won't even know what you just read because everything was the same. Sometimes you need a page-long paragraph. Sometimes you need a 1 sentence or 3-word sentence like paragraph. You need to be varied in your writing. Also, other than the publishers, what we do is we go into reviewing like contemporary writers. We view them with this bias. When we have our Hemingways and our Faulkners and our, Melvilles, we're reading like the best of the best, the classics, what stood out, what were the nails sticking out of the board. We don't see all the other writers back then that probably had the uniform style of writing.
Yeah, definitely.
Because if you look at the list of the bestsellers for every year, it's usually none of the great classics that we celebrate today.
I know, it's always weird, right? Like these books, like #1 bestsellers that you never ever heard of. Yeah, I know, it's strange. On this other tack, so before we were talking about workshop fiction, but now we're talking about commercial stuff. I think one of the things that happens is like there's a Hollywood-like process with that. It's the same way where major studios can produce some really great movies, but they also do this thing where, they have these movies that are meant to be marketed to a specific audience and meant to capitalize on what we need is more zombie films this year,
Yeah.
So Walking Dead may have established itself in the first season as being this kind of unique show. I mean, there was a bunch of zombie stuff before that. Then it's like, okay, everybody's like, well, we need a zombie show too, right? And so I do think that there are those trends. And just like there's some really great TV shows and movies that are produced by major, major studios, I think the same is true for the big publishers where there's really fantastic works of art that do get published. But there is also this kind of thing where they have all of these commercial considerations for trends and audiences and marketing. They're outside of the consideration for, is this a great book?
They take the odd out of it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said, Spencer.
They take the odd out of it. Like out of the way, like,
The odd out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And yet there's still really great books that are published year after year. But I don't think it's great that the big publishers seem to have consolidated into just these 4 or 5 entities. I don't think that's great for writing. In publishing the way it was in the mid-century, at least that's my understanding, the mid-20th century, there was always a sense of, publish these commercially popular books in order to publish somebody like Faulkner. And maybe that's still true, but my understanding, I'm a different generation, but when I read about that era, it seems like publishing moved away a bit from the old gentlemanly pursuit that it once was, the Tweety kind of thing, into where those Hollywood commercial considerations have become, even if you have an editor that's very passionate about great writing, there's these commercial considerations that they have as businesses that weigh down on the whole enterprise, which is why, indie publishers are really interesting, where you encounter, because indie publishers are sort of wedded to, I want to publish a great book, where the commercial considerations are far lesser than when you have a big corporation behind it.
Well, the history of publishing is the same as history of TV and movies. It was exactly what you said. If we want to publish Faulkner, we need this many authors that are just going to sell to keep us in business,
Right.
So
you got to keep the lights on.
Yeah. If you look at all the great authors, other than Hemingway and maybe like Fitzgerald's first book, most of them did not do well. I mean, Faulkner, I don't think sold for a long time. I know Cormac McCarthy didn't sell it. He was out of print by the 90s until All the Pretty Horses came out. You just have a lot of these authors who are celebrated so highly today, but in their time, nobody gave a shit because it was just academics and
they weren't necessarily big. They weren't necessarily big commercial writers in that sense. Although Fitzgerald, who you brought up, he made his money writing short stories. That was his bread and butter. Like, imagine this. Like, back then, he could publish a story with the Saturday Evening, the Saturday Evening Post, Saturday Evening Review. He was getting paid like $3,000 for a short story back then,
which is astronomical.
You could buy a house, and that's what he would do in between novels, was publish a lot of short stories, because that's where he made a lot of money, was from publishing short stories. That market's gone.
But I always wondered how the publisher was able to recoup that payment, because it was really high. Think about getting $3,000 for a short story now. Unless you're selling it to Netflix, you're not going to get anything above $1,000.
There's almost no commercial market for short stories at all outside of there's Harper's and the New Yorker. Atlantic, I think, has stopped publishing fiction, I think. Outside of that, there's some prestigious literary magazines and things like that. But there's no market for the short story anymore, which is a shame. This used to be something, people would get their magazine where they're reading about, I don't know, beauty tips or whatever. Actually, the women's magazines carried that on for the longest, where Mademoiselle and Cosmo and all those, that's where Sylvia Plath came from, was publishing a story in one of those. That was a market for ordinary people. And I kind of wish that would come back, in the internet era, where why can't the New York Times publish? They did publish a couple a few years ago, but I wish they do it regularly. Why can't there be a market for fiction, a commercial market for magazines, especially in these days where everything is online? What do they have to lose?
It might have been last episode or off air that we were just talking about the fall of Playboy and how great the fiction in it was.
Yeah, Playboy was a great, and they published a lot of science fiction too.
Yeah, they had some of the top writers of all time were in there, and it's just why don't we have things like that? Just going through the...
Well, I think the price of prints and stuff...
But still, we have online, and there's so many... They don't want to pay. I just don't think they're interested. Maybe not enough people read now, or just they don't think read, but I think of just going through the short story market, most of I don't know, I'm trying to think of some of the payments I've seen that are worthwhile. You might get ones that you get $100 or up to $450, $500 if you're really lucky, but those are very prestigious, hard to get into journals and reviews. Say you want to write a 5,000 literary story. The amount of work to do that, and often now you have to pay to submit to a lot of these places. If they give you $40 or $50 for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks worth of work, is that really worth it? No.
Right. Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying is I can conceive of a world where if the major magazines and newspapers started printing fiction again, so maybe the cost, as Spencer brought up, of print media, but these days people don't read so much print media. I read the Times online. I haven't read a print copy of the Times in years. they could do it where, let's say it was just online, cost them almost nothing. And because, it's kind of a shame that the short story market has become mainly in literary and small magazines. And the main audience for that is the kinds of people who read literary magazines, who are people like us, other writers. And that's a shame because, back in Fitzgerald's day or Sylvia Plath's day, these stories were meant for just people who like to read. I think they ought to do it. I don't see that what they have to lose. And the short story form, I feel, is very important to fiction. It really is.
Well, right now, just from our personal experience, the highest demand market for short stories is genre fiction. Usually horror, crime, romance, and sci-fi. Those are erotica too is a big one, but I haven't really looked into that. But those are the ones that seem to be paying the most, putting out even indie presses or just individuals putting out anthologies and just things to get your work in. But when it comes to literary fiction, you have the university reviews, a lot of those, and you still have your Dublin Review, Paris Review, New Yorker, things you'll never get into. But yeah, it's slim pickings.
No, you bring up a good point. Like there's still genre magazines, and they've kept that alive. Like, I used to regularly read Science Fiction and Fantasy magazine or Asimov's magazine. I also read, there was like Alfred Hitchcock, sort of, these were the inheritors of like the pulp magazines from like the 20s and 30s, and they kept going. You're right. Like in genre fiction, there's like a richer market for the short story writer. They still have, it may not be a super high paying market, but they still have a commercial market for genre fiction because they have a audience that knows they like to read short stories and will go out and buy a magazine to read short stories.
Well, we've hit the hour mark, so we'll wind down. I'll have one more question for you.
Sure.
What's the literary scene in New York right now? What would you say? Is it thriving? Because in Pittsburgh, like they call it Littsburg now, so you do have a lot of poetry readings and stuff I haven't gone to yet. Coronavirus, like the pandemic really shut down a lot of things for a while. And I know New York was completely shut down. So has it revitalized? Is the literary scene booming?
There's always a lot of stuff going on. It's particularly like in Brooklyn where I live, like you basically can't swing a cat without hitting a writer in Brooklyn. So there's definitely like a lot of reading of like even small ones, like lots and lots of reading events, literary things. So I would say it's very much thriving. And certainly like this is like the publishing capital. So you have like, the New Yorker events and the 92nd Street Y and places like that are like the top shelf literary events as well. So it's pretty happening. I mean, the bad thing about New York is getting so expensive. It's difficult for writers or artists to live here. I mean, that's actually the real danger of New York is that it's becoming difficult for struggling artists to be able to live here, period.
Yeah, they're struggling to the point where they can't even afford to write because there's already not a lot of money in it. Now you can't, you have $3,000 rent or something ridiculous. I couldn't imagine.
Yeah, you gotta work like 2 or 3 jobs just to, get that closet to live in.
Yeah.
Exactly, which is why maybe a smaller city like Pittsburgh, which by the way, I've been to Pittsburgh. It's a great city. I actually really like it. I could see that there might be a more thriving scene of artists, young artists and writers, particularly in smaller cities like that, where you don't have to work all the time to be able to pay your extravagant rent and leave no time for writing, where you can have, some breathing space and a more livable life on less money. So that is a bad thing about New York.
New York has the opportunity. You have all these events and all these writers, and you can showcase your work so much easier, but you also have way more competition.
Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly true.
So, I mean, that's good if you're really good at writing and your product you feel very strongly about, you don't really have to worry about that competition, but at the same time, it's still there and you're all fighting for that's the thing. There's more writers than I feel there are readers anymore.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I know that's not true, but it seems that way when you're submitting work or you're trying to go to a publisher. Yeah, it just feels like there's more
particularly
writers.
in the cell phone internet age, where everybody's streaming TV shows. Yeah.
If we could only get to that utopian world where everyone's reading books on their phone, not streaming stupid Netflix and
TikToks.
I still get cheered up though on the subway where I do see a lot of people reading. So take heart, boys.
When I see those random readers, somebody with especially a physical book, I mean, I don't really see newspapers anymore either, but like an actual physical book out in the wild, I'm like, oh my goodness.
Well, that's what I always want. What I always wonder, because even like anytime I go to like a doctor's appointment, anything, or just even like in my bag, I either have like a book, some comics, something, because like if I have like 5 free minutes, like I'm gonna need something to so I don't have to talk to somebody or like have a conversation or something like.
Which is so much more worthwhile than doom scrolling Instagram or Facebook or Blue Sky
definitely.
or any of these.
But I always wonder what like other people think, like in the break room where they see, especially with me being like a on the younger side of be like what he's reading.
He's not 75.
They know how to do that
still. I take heart. I see people reading. Maybe we're due for a comeback. I think everybody's sick of streaming TV's kind of tanked these days, and I think reading is going to make a comeback.
Well, there's still those areas like, I go to Maine or something. I'm like, oh, people are more intelligent up here. They're actually reading. When you hit mountain towns or certain places in the South, it's easy to get discouraged. But there are actually sections of the countries that are literate. It's not just New York. And
well, like I've mentioned here before, like I always try to do my part with any of my friends, like kids and stuff at a young age. I always try to get kid books or comics, or just like, even if like when they get older they don't like that stuff anymore, that like the hope is like at least like the reading is stuck, and like that becomes part of like their is the plan. I mean,
I probably wouldn't be a big reader if my mom didn't read to me all the time when I was a kid, but a lot of parents nowadays they probably weren't read to, and they don't read to their kids, and it's an awful cycle.
Yeah, no, you need to acquire the taste for reading for fun. That's what it's about. Yeah.
Well, the education system, which I'm sure you can attest to, really beats that out of you a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm like you, where my mom encouraged reading and books around the house and all that stuff, and so I read for fun. I wasn't reading because somebody was making me read. Thank you guys. I wanted to just thank you for having me on here. It was really awesome.
No problem. Like sometimes when we have guests on, it's a little difficult because the topics aren't that varied, just depending on the guest. Like sometimes, everyone has different interests. So you coincide perfectly with us.
Yes.
You can
just go.
Yeah, so we could do this for 10 hours.
Oh, well, I really enjoyed I could talk to you guys all night. I really enjoyed hanging out with you.
Yeah, we definitely have to have you back on at some time.
Yeah.
I would love to come back on.
Well, actually, you know what? That's the final question. Do you have any other works in progress or anything coming out?
I don't have anything coming out right now. I'm sort of ending the year that this came out, so I'm sort of wrapping up some of the focus on that. I have stuff that I was working on both before and things that I've taken notes for, but I am looking forward to this year shifting my focus to getting back to writing new stuff. So
excellent. Well, where can the folks find you? And maybe more importantly, where can they find My Life of Crime essays and other entertainments?
My Life of Crime is available anywhere online. Just Google My Life of Crime for Tyler by Tyler C. Gore. You can buy it from Amazon or bookshop.org or any of the online sellers. It's available in a few bookshops, and you can also ask your bookshop to order it. And you can also visit my website, which is tylergore.com. And my book is published by Sagging Meniscus Press, a great indie press. You can also find out where to buy it from their website.
All right, awesome. Well, if you folks want to check out our stuff as well, I don't know what we got going on, but you can just find us at DPW Podcast. We are on X, Facebook, and YouTube. Instagram, that's probably one we do. You can also check out my work at calebjamesk.com. I got more publishing stuff to post soon, I think. And Spencer's OnlyFans is the Bermuda
Barnacle?
I was going to say bagel. Something. Barnacle basher.
Yeah.
Quite still. So, Tyler, thank you again for coming on, and I'll have to have you on in the future. And thank you, folks, for listening. We will check you out next time.
Hey, Caleb, you wanted to see me?
Ah, Spencer, my good fellow. I've been expecting you.
Yeah, so did you want something or
Want? Goodness no. Require.
require?
Yes. I require your services for the briefest of moments.
Okay.
Surely you can see the predicament I'm in.
Well, actually, no, I can't. I lost my glasses at the pub last night.
A pub, you say? Surely you can't be serious.
As serious as a fought during a recto, because I am. And stop calling me Shirley.
Rightio. Anyway, if your spectacles were affixed upon your face, you'd see that I, the host of the most prodigious writing and books podcast in the business, has been immobilized by a rather substantial stack of fallen folios.
What?
My to-read pile finally fell on me while I was taking a nap.
But you're on a podcast table.
I hardly see how that matters.
And you're naked.
I hardly see how that matters.
Dude, your hairy ass is touching my drink coaster.
I hardly see how that matters.
It matters to me.
Can you just unbury me?
No way. Your reckless reading got you into this mess.
Blockhead! Wait! Don't go! There's a copy of War and Peace wedged in my taint. Spencer! Can you at least leave me a bottle of whiskey? Hello? Can't get enough drunken nonsense? Listen to new episodes of the Drunken Pen Writing Podcast every Tuesday wherever you get your pods.